So good afternoon. I'd like to thank everybody that could join us in this afternoon. And I'd like to welcome Professor Nicholas Lombardo. And in the name of Grupo PARE, Research Group in Argumentation and Rhetoric, I'd like to thank Dr. Nicholas Lombardo for accepting our invitation. It's a pleasure to have you here in Brazil with us. We're looking forward to hear from you and to have the opportunity to watch your lecture about such an important topic, emotion, rhetoric, and Thomas Aquinas. I'd like to thank University of Franca, Unifran, for opening its doors and making this event possible. I also would like to thank my colleagues from the Graduate Studies in Linguistics at University of Franca. I would like to thank all the members of our research group, PARE, especially Pedro Gulki, who was responsible for all the contacts that made this event possible. And last but not least, I would like to thank all the members of ERA, research group from the Catholic University in Brazil. And now I invite our master's student, Pedro Gulki, to introduce Professor Lombardo.
Before we begin, a few words. We are currently facing a global pandemic that has affected everyone in many different ways. It has certainly affected us here in the University of Franca. And yet, here we are, in what is certain to be yet another fruitful event. Some things are in order. First, I'd like to thank Dra. Maria Flávia Figueiredo for helping and encouraging me to set up this event. She is an amazing mentor who grants her pupils enough freedom to find themselves, however, with enough discipline for them to be the best of themselves. I'd like to thank Giovanni for helping us with marketing. His work is both interesting and elegant, and also it was free. So at least let me pay back in kindness. Thank you very much. Finally, and perhaps most obviously, a special thanks to Dr. Nicholas. I'm sure that his day today was also abruptly shaken by the current affairs. Nevertheless, he found it in his heart not only to be here, but also to take the time to research, write, and tailor today's lecture to our specific objectives. Thank you very much. So, Dr. Nicholas Lombardo is an associate professor of historical and systematic theology. He received his PhD from the University of Cambridge in 2010 and came to the Catholic University of America in the fall of 2011. He has spent time visiting as a visiting fellow at the University of Fribourg and Durham University. And he has taught as a visiting professor at Peking University and the Chinese University of Hong Kong. His research has addressed topics such as Thomas Aquinas' philosophy and theology of emotions. His 2010 book, The Logic of Desire, Aquinas on Emotion, received an award of the John Tenton Award. Said award speaks of the Father's Nicholas' prominence and promise as a theologian and philosopher. So now, our warmest welcome to our guest, so that he may act as a guide and a great way to Aquinas' treatise of the Passions.
So this is a step in the right direction for me. So it's really a pleasure. And I was thinking about how, from my understanding of what might be most useful for me to talk about today, I thought I'd first talk about why be interested in Aquinas on this topic and how it relates to the issue of rhetoric. So just to give you a little background. I'll start with my own experience of becoming interested in Aquinas on this. My first degree was in philosophy, and in one class I had, my third year, we covered Aquinas and went through quickly his approach to the passions. And I found it completely uninteresting and boring and seemingly useless. I mean, psychology has moved on 800 years from the Middle Ages. So I just kind of tuned out and didn't find anything interesting. But then a few years later when I was doing my graduate work, I got some keys to understand what Aquinas was doing, to kind of see beyond all the trees and see the forest and the deeper themes which can be hidden behind Aquinas' way of talking. One of the reasons why it can be hard to get inside what Aquinas has to say is because even though he says has a lot to say about emotion, he himself shows very little emotion. I mean, when you read Aquinas, it can be like reading a computer printout, just completely without flavor almost. There are very few times when he kind of shows emotion. One time he's talking about somebody else, and he says they most stupidly assert something. So you can see he was angry about it. But other than that, you barely see anything. And often when I was telling people that I was doing research on Aquinas on emotion, people would often ask, did Aquinas write anything about emotion? Even people who knew Aquinas well. A few times people would say, did Aquinas have emotions personally himself? Yet despite this, and I think these are common impressions that people have of Aquinas, even if they start to look at him in his texts. And yet, there's actually great reason to be interested in what Aquinas has to say. And I want to give you a sense of the lay of the land of his historical significance and also his historical influence up to the present day. So first of all, one thing that immediately is striking is that in his masterpiece, the Summa Theologiae, which huge, hundreds of pages, over 1,000 pages long, and it's divided into questions. It doesn't read like a normal treatise. It picks questions, he gives arguments for and against, and he argues in that context. In the Summa, in the questions on the passions, which is about it's 25 questions or so. When he wrote it, it was the longest treatment of the passions ever written in Western civilization, and quite possibly, although I can't really verify this, in any civilization. So he went above and beyond in terms of focused attention on what is passion, what is emotion, compared to his historical predecessors. And in his writing on emotion, we see that he was drawing on every significant figure that he could get his hands on in the 13th century Italian libraries that he would go to. He, of course, drew on Aristotle, who I know is of great interest to your research group. We know that by the time he was writing the treatise on the Passions, the Rhetoric had recently been translated because he cites it during the treatise on the Passions. So he had that. He's drawing on Augustine, a Eastern Christian thinker, Nemesius of Emesa. I think he's 400s, 500s, who had a lot to say on emotion. John of Damascus, his teacher Albert the Great. And he drew on everybody, and not just Christian thinkers, but obviously non-Christian thinkers like Aristotle, Jewish thinkers, Muslim thinkers, and he draws them in. And when he's drawing on their work, Aquinas is an extremely charitable thinker in the sense of he tries to put people in the best possible light. And so when he's drawing on these different thinkers, he tries to interpret them in the most sympathetic possible light. Sometimes, to our point of view, it can almost be over the top, like he's not being really clear about what these people actually were saying. But that's his kind of way of proceeding. I came across a great metaphor to describe what Aquinas does, which I've often thought back to, which is that Aquinas is like the host of a cocktail party. And he's got a lot of people, a lot of guests. He knows that this person has those political views, this other person has those on the opposite, and he's trying to have kind of a good conversation, draw people in. If somebody says something kind of provocative, try to soften it, then shift to somebody else. And so the way he draws on thinkers, he's not dishonest. He's not making them say things they don't say, but he's trying to draw them together and synthesize them. So in other words, so far, just on the historical originality of Aquinas, you have the longest treatise ever written. you have him drawing in all the major authorities he could find of different religions, different eras of time, and he's trying to synthesize them and bring some kind of unity out of them. And in fact, sometimes that synthetic drive can be an issue because of, it would have been better if he had been more discerning and critical rather than trying to draw everything together. But that's maybe later we'll talk about that. So that's his historical significance in terms of just historically how original he was. Then in terms of the influence that he had. After Aquinas, the later medieval thinkers were largely, if they wrote in any significant extent on the passions, they were taking Aquinas as their starting point, as their reference point. They may have agreed with him, they may have disagreed with him, usually it'd be a combination, but he was kind of the person that you had as a reference point. Then, in the early modern period, Aquinas still retains a kind of a position of dominance in terms of influence. There's an important book on emotion in the 17th century by Susan James. It was written about 25 years ago. And when talking about early modern philosophy of the emotion, she sees that there were two main figures that early modern philosophers were dealing with when it came to the passions. And that was Aristotle and Aquinas. Those were the two main reference points. What this starts to shift, and especially a key moment is Descartes, who, with his writings on the passions, becomes a new point of reference. But Descartes himself saw himself as constructing an alternative to Aquinas, very consciously. So even for Descartes, who represents a big shift away from this kind of Aristotelian context, even he is doing it very consciously as an alternative to Aquinas. And so that's a bit of, kind of the historical. So after that point, he starts to fade. But that has been changing over the past 40 years. There's been kind of a reemergence of interest in Aquinas on the passions. A lot of this has a result of the general renewal of interest in the emotions, both the history of the emotions, the philosophy of the emotions, the cognitive revolution in psychology and other related disciplines. And in this context, people have been rediscovering Aquinas from a number of different disciplines. Analytic philosophy has started to, over the past 30 years or so, look to him as an important reference point, who is seen as, in many ways, and come back to this, a very interesting story, who seems to be anticipating a lot of the cognitive revolution in understanding emotions and understanding their cognitive dimensions. So that's, within analytic philosophy, within scholarship of Aquinas, it's a very interesting story. So Aquinas is one of those figures who, since shortly after his death, has had a whole school of thought dedicated to commenting on him and so on. But one interesting lacuna in the history of Thomist scholarship is that the passions get short shrift compared to other topics. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon that even for scholars of Aquinas, there's a strong case to be made that Aquinas was this big reference point for the passions, for, just across the fields, across, philosophical alignments. And yet, even for scholars of Aquinas, this aspect of his thought was not well appreciated, was not front and center. So in going ahead to the 20th century, there are kind of several phases in the 20th century where scholars of Aquinas spend more time kind of focusing on what he has to say about the passions as a resource for contemporary thought or for understanding, other aspects of his thought. So there's a period in the early 20th century, and then in the 30s, 40s, and then since the 1980s or so, there's been kind of a continuous stream of interest among Aquinas scholars in the topic of the passions. But even so, in the 20 years ago at the meeting of the American Catholic Philosophical Association, their big annual meeting, somebody says there's probably no element of Aquinas' moral theory more neglected by scholars of Aquinas than what he has to say about the passions. So this is all to say that there's this interesting history of great historical originality, great historical influence for a few hundred years, and then it kind of drops out. Even the scholars of Aquinas are not paying as much attention to what Aquinas has to say about it. And then in the past 30, 40 years, there's kind of a snowballing renewal of interest in Aquinas, both in general and also among scholars of Aquinas. So that's kind of where we are today in this, in the appreciation of Aquinas. Now, I mentioned before, I talked about Aquinas being rediscovered, and there's kind of an interesting side story to this, which I have kind of worked to reconstruct. So what I'm saying is kind of tentative. It's my attempt to reconstruct things, but I feel pretty confident about this. So the one, historically, there's the whole issue of why in the past 60 years has there been this renewed interest in emotion? Where did that come from? So how exactly did it start? It's generally said it started in the 1960s, and it happens both in philosophy and psychology, roughly around the same time. And then by the 80s and then late 90s, then many, many disciplines have picked up this great renewed interest in emotion. So what were the key things that got the ball rolling? Well, there are two things that I think are widely agreed to be key things. In the field of psychology, there's a woman, Hungarian woman, Magda Arnold, who was an immigrant to the United States, taught in Chicago, and she wrote 2 volumes on emotion in the early 1960s, where she argued that there was a cognitive dimension to emotion that needed to be appreciated, that the emotions were about not just kind of these irrational, out-of-nowhere experiences, but that they're intimately connected with cognition and reason. And that I think it was a multi-volume book on the emotions, ended up being pivotal for the emergence of the field of cognitive psychology, the root of cognitive behavioral schools of psychology, which she did, especially I think it was through a student or colleague, Lazarus, that became a key strand of things. Meanwhile, within Anglo-American philosophy, the philosopher Anthony Kenny, who's still living, I think, late 80s, who wrote a book called Action, Emotion, and Will, in which he talks about emotion, and that was also a key work that there were many in Anglo-American philosophy and that was one of a key work that early in the 1960s played some role to the process of this interest in looking at emotion and their cognitive development. Well, both Magda Arnold and Anthony Kenny had spent a lot of time studying Aquinas on the emotions. Magda Arnold, I believe, had been trained in a Freudian approach to psychology. And then in the 1950s, she spent a lot of time reading Aquinas on the passions and integrating what she'd learned from modern psychoanalytic techniques and theory and bringing that into contact with Aquinas. Meanwhile, Anthony Kenny himself had spent a lot of time studying Wittgenstein and Thomas Aquinas and bringing them together. And those were, so in other words, the interesting back history to this rediscovery of Aquinas is that he seems to have played a seminal role in the very fact that there's been a rediscovery of emotion in many different disciplines. These key figures, among others, were themselves deeply influenced by Aquinas in their rediscovery of emotion. So that's a bit about the historical influence and significance of Aquinas. And this, now, what does he actually say about emotions? What, to say as an overview? Well, to understand the overview, I think it's helpful to understand it's a speculative question, but we have good reason to, good grounds to speculate. Why did Aquinas spend so much time on emotion in the first place? Why did he, devote all his attention a way nobody had before? Why was he so interested? Well, there is good reason to think, independent of anything to do with emotion, one of the leading scholars of Aquinas of the 20th century, Leonard Boyle, who was a medievalist, concluded that when Aquinas wrote his great work of Summa Theologiae, which covers every realm of theology and philosophy that were current in the 13th century, that he concluded that why did Aquinas write this massive work to begin with? That a lot of it had to do with giving a context for an understanding of the Christian moral life. And so that's a very well accepted theory. And then so why would he have written all this work with a special goal, oriented towards a context for Christian moral theory? Well, it seems that Aquinas was very concerned and dissatisfied with approaches to morality that were focused on willpower, as though the moral life was simply about willing to do the good thing and doing it, as though morality is just about you will to do something, or just obeying commands. And that what he wanted to do instead was to give a context for understanding the moral life, where the moral life is not just about doing the right thing or obeying a command, but it's about the flourishing, the happiness of the whole human person, that the whole human person is involved in virtue. It's not just about willpower, it's about the passions, it's about the emotions. And so one of the reasons why, and this kind of, I think this is the case, is that he said, well, if you really want to understand what this vision of what ethics is about, you need to spend time understanding what the passions are and how they work and how they're not just kind of a problem, but that they are a resource for living ethically. There's something, their energy to be channeled into virtue. And then as a close connection related to that issue, Thomas Aquinas, like myself, was a member of the Dominican order, which is an order that's officially known as the Order of Preachers. And so there also was the objective of, okay, here laying out this understanding of ethics where passions have this role, but also then to be able to then communicate that vision through preaching and therefore rhetoric. So those are all to, a picture of why he writes, some context, and then this leads into the question of the big picture that Aquinas has. There's, okay, so let's say you decide you want to give this full vision of ethics. And all that I've said about the passions, their role in ethics, many contemporary philosophers, whether religious or not, would be very supportive of that kind of vision. So why do you need to talk about everything else? Well, for Aquinas, there is a deep, both philosophical and theological place for understanding the passions. Namely, that God has implanted desires within creation to kind of push creatures towards their fulfillment, towards their happiness. And so he sees emotion as, in a sense, a expression of the desire implanted within humans, within animals, to drive us towards fulfillment. And so before he even starts talking about the passions, he's talked about God, in whom he also places desire, appetite, and then sees God creating the world out of desire, and implanting within the world a desire for what leads to anything's happiness and perfection, and ultimately back to himself in some way. In a very Platonic scheme, exitus reditus, going out from God and then returning. Exitus reditus. And for Aquinas, the emotions play an important role in leading humans, focusing on humans, towards what leads to happiness and also towards back to God. And so that's one of the reasons why for Aquinas to adequately accomplish his task of giving a vision of the moral life, he has to also talk about God, for example. Now, Aquinas is talking about God and these other things for other reasons as well. But in terms of what is the theme of the Summa, this notion of desire is one of a key theme that goes through it and finds expression in the emotions in particular. My book on Aquinas, I titled it The Logic of Desire. And that title came from an appreciation for how, in Aquinas, the emotions are, in a sense, expressions of desire. They're kind of the way desire gets worked out in the concrete. Now, sometimes emotions are about moving away from something and so on, but that ultimately, even emotions that repulse us are ordered towards how do we achieve what we most truly and deeply desire. And so 2 images as an overview for Aquinas that I think are helpful. If you take one of the great cathedrals of the Middle Ages, a Gothic cathedral, you know, the standard structures, you've got the center aisle, the nave, and then you've got lots of little side chapels. And if you look at Aquinas' Summa, you'll see that it's covering all these different topics. And he's got different subsections where he's covering these different topics. But that if you take a step back and you look at the theme of desire, starting in God, in whom there is desire, and then implanted by God into creation, into humans, and to lead creation back to God, it's like being in a medieval cathedral and looking at the nave, where everything is lining up. And so that's one. So in other words, to say is that one of the reasons why Aquinas spends so much time on the passions is because they're so important to his vision of God, the world, human destiny. And he has a fundamentally positive view of their place. He, like anybody who's sane, recognizes that emotions and desires can be problematic, they can be disordered, they can cause trouble, but that at their root, he sees them as something fundamentally positive that is meant to be channeled, in a sense. And so when the big questions of ethics, for Aquinas, it's very striking in the Summa Theologiae, Aquinas spends very little time, I mean, almost astoundingly little time, on things like the 10 Commandments. He's more interested in virtues, how the emotions, the passions get perfected, or the ways in which they go wrong in the vices. For Aquinas, ethics is about the fulfillment of nature, and a lot of that has to do with bringing emotion and desire to its proper end. Okay, so that's a bit of overview, and I hope gives you I don't know how much all of you have had a chance to look at Aquinas or think about his work, but that I think gives you an orientation for his significance and why he's interesting, I think, today. And as contrary to my first impression of Aquinas, that actually what he has to say is quite interesting and relevant even today. Okay, so within Aquinas, one of the things that can be very a problem to entering into Aquinas' thought is simply terminology and how he uses terms and how he divides up emotion. And this is, the the category of emotion as we now know it today is only 200 years old. And so not only do we today, you go into any academic field, there's no consensus agreement on what is an emotion. And so we have that kind of lack of consensus today, and then we're going to have to go back 800 years to somebody else's language, somebody else's categories, and that could be very challenging, and in a lot of the literature, people are often make mistakes in interpreting Aquinas because of these problems of categories. So what to say about his categories? So first, in understanding how Aquinas thinks about emotion, it's helpful to know that Aquinas seems to have three categories of entities in mind when he thinks about the passions and emotions. Humans, first of all, animals, who Aquinas fully holds, experience passions, and also angels, who he also sees as persons with both experience of knowing and desiring and loving, and also God. So Aquinas has humans who are this combination of material and spiritual, animals, purely material, and then purely spiritual beings. And he has these three categories in mind as he's thinking through. And so here on this, I see this diagram. So first of all, there is a category of passions. And within passions, there are two kinds of passions. Then passions are things that are experienced by animals and humans. There are first passions of the body. A passion of the body is like pain or thirst, some kind of physical sensation. And one thing that they have in common is that these passions of the body are not about anything. They're not intentional. They are simply there. So you might say, I have a pain in my foot. It's not about anything. You just feel pain in your foot. That is, for Aquinas, a passion of the body. Passion of the soul, however, is something that is about something. So, if it could be a feeling of sadness, where you are sad about something. You get some bad news and you feel sad about something. Or you are angry at something. Some situation has come to pass and you are angry at it. Now, one thing that is different from, and often what happens is passions of the soul are translated simply as emotions. But that, at least in English, can be misleading because for Aquinas, if, for example, you see some chocolate cake and you are hungry and you want that chocolate cake, that is a passion of the soul. There's a combination, like, if like you're feeling hunger, like, your stomach's growling, or, you feel something in some physical pain or discomfort because you are hungry, that's a passion of the body. But your desire to go over and eat that cake is a passion of the soul. Today, though, we might not call that an emotion. We tend to think of emotion, at least in English, being something that is more sophisticated. But for Aquinas, if it's about something, then it's a passion of the soul. Now, then you have another category called intellectual affections. Now, this category is not well appreciated in the writing of Aquinas in terms of scholars of Aquinas. Whereas Aquinas spends a lot of time talking about the passions of the soul. He says, okay, we're going to talk about the passions, and he gives 25 questions on them. He doesn't do that with the intellectual affections. He kind of talks about them here and there. And these intellectual affections are like the passions of the soul, are about things. They are a response to something that is known. or perceived. But unlike the passions of the soul, they're not connected to a body. And so they are things that angels, God has, and so on. So those are the main categories. And you notice at the top I have like passions at this diagram, pointing to passions of the body, passions of the soul, and then affections points to both passions of the soul and intellectual affections. Because Aquinas will sometimes call passions of the soul affections. And so to just translate into Aquinas into our contemporary categories, I think if you say the category of affection is for Aquinas, roughly speaking, what we mean by emotion today. So that's biggest overview in terms of different categories of emotion. Now, what is, for Aquinas, how the emotions work? So whether you're talking about passions of the soul or affections, they are always in response to some kind of cognition. There is always first some kind of cognitive judgment or experience, which then results in an emotion. So a sheep sniffs a wolf, and the sheep is now going to experience fear, but it's responding to some kind of perception and cognition. Likewise, with us, we humans, for Aquinas, are complicated. There's no such thing as a pure passion of the soul in our experience. For us, there's always kind of a mingling of our emotional life between the realm of our experience that's purely physical and material and the realm of our experience that is immaterial, that's transcendent or spiritual. So it's always mixed in us. But we have a similar way of responding insofar as we have some kind of experience, a cognitive experience. We make a judgment, we think, we reason, and then in response to that, we experience some kind of emotion or affection. And so one way to think, Aquinas uses Aristotle's terminology of a passive power to describe what the passions are. And one way to think of it is they are like a spring-loaded trap that's waiting to go off. And a judgment, a cognition happens. There's a mental process of judgment. And then in response, there is a response of an emotion. Now, this is for Aquinas, this happens at the same time. It's not like it's not like chronology. But following Aristotle, Aquinas makes a sharp division between desiring and knowing, in that there is a kind of a knowing realm, and that things are classified according to, because they're about some kind of knowing or cognition, whether it involves the senses or it doesn't involve the senses. And then there is the realm of desiring. And so for Aquinas, the emotions are all somehow movements of desire, but they are always, so they're not in themselves cognitive. This is where, compared to a lot of contemporary philosophy, Aquinas is very interesting because he doesn't fall into some of the neat divisions in contemporary philosophy between cognitive accounts of emotion and non-cognitive accounts of emotion. For Aquinas, if we were trying to put him into today's categories, Aquinas would say that emotions are non-cognitive. Emotions don't think. They're not a thought. But at the same time, emotions are always responding to cognition, or maybe prompting cognition. So emotions are intrinsically linked to cognition, but they themselves are not cognition. One more important point is in the Middle Ages, there was a debate about how to understand the passions. And it had to do with an ambiguity in Aristotle. And the question was, are the passions qualities or movements? Are they qualities in the sense of, like we talk about almost like a mood, like I am angry today, I am sad today, I am happy today. It's almost like it is your quality, how to describe you. Or are the passions movements towards some objective? You know, I am angry about that. It makes me want to do that to solve my anger. And Aquinas' majority opinion among medieval thinkers was that the passions were qualities. But Aquinas says, no, they're movements. And I think that is an important window on how important it is for Aquinas that the passions are leading us, they're movements, leading us towards, you know, what hopefully what is good for us, but they're somehow moving us in a direction. Reflect his overall view that the reason why we have emotions in the first place is because God has put them into human nature to guide us towards fulfillment. Now, I'm looking at the time. I see I'm just going to be quick about these 11 types of the passions. So Aquinas follows a Franciscan thinker from 10 or 20 years before Aquinas, John of La Rochelle, who proposes that there are 11 basic passions. And Aquinas follows John of La Rochelle. And this is an area where it's too bad he did, because there are some problems in this structure of 11, which I can't talk about now. But the most important thing to sum the way Aquinas structures these 11 passions is he has first-order passions and second-order passions. The first-order passions are things like desire and pleasure. And then you have things like sadness and sorrow. So the most kind of elemental kinds of emotions. Desire, you know, pleasure, avoidance, sadness. So that, you know, that basic level of basic desires and so on. And then he has a kind of second order series of passions. And these are passions that are more complicated. Hope, despair, daring or courage, fear, anger. And all of these second order passions are about somehow getting what the first order passions want. They're all about, you know, if you get angry, why do you get angry? Because your desires were thwarted, or somebody did something that brought you pain or sadness. So these second order passions are all about helping the first order passions get what they want. And this, there's more I'll say about these individual elemental passions, but that's too complicated and we don't have time. But what I do want to emphasize is that for Aquinas, that what the ethical life should follow this order of passions. So in other words, the ethical person for Aquinas puts first, in an ordered way, desire and pleasure and avoiding sadness, and then these other passions that help it out, fear, anger, hope, despair, these are all about helping the first order passions get what they want. So, for example, if fear is helpful, if you are in a dark alley and you hear a noise, fear kicks in and you are more alert, you're more attentive, and you can avoid danger better. But of course, as often happens in our experience, fear or anxiety can become disproportionate and be too much of a motivation. And for Aquinas, that's not just, in a sense, an unfortunate thing. That means that there's something about human flourishing which is not well ordered. That for Aquinas, for example, to put it into a moral realm, if someone is doing a good thing out of fear, that could be a problem if there's not also a desire for the good thing which is kind of leading things. Okay, so those are the 11 types of passions, and then briefly, with types of intellectual affections, Aquinas does not list them all. He just speaks about them very generally, but more or less the intellectual affections are like the 11 passions, except there are no second-order intellectual affections. There isn't a kind of anger in the level of intellectual affection. Everything is first order among the intellectual affections. And incidentally, this basic division between first and second order passions, that's my terminology, but it essentially goes back to Aristotle in divisions of passions. With passion, reason, and virtue, I want to just focus on the quote. I think the next one might be the quote. Yeah, so this is a passage from Aristotle's Politics, which Aquinas quotes 5 different times in the Summa. It's something that was a very important text for Aquinas, given by how often he quotes it. And what he's talking about, Aristotle is using an analogy from politics, talking about how in different forms of government, there's a tyrant who, has absolute control over people, and Aristotle says, and that is like the control that we have over our body. Your hand, you say, raise your hand, your hand doesn't fight you. But on the other hand, the passions are more like a kind of constitutional monarchy or democratic situation where the passions don't just do what you tell them. If you're feeling sad, you can't just say, stop feeling sad. Your passions listen to you. You can't just move them like you can move your hand. And this metaphor that you can read the full text that Aquinas develops it. But this gives you an idea of Aquinas' understanding that although for Aquinas the passions are non-cognitive, they are intrinsically oriented towards guidance by reason. That we can guide our emotions. We can't control them like we can control our bodies, but we can guide them. And at one point, he talks about how you can experience this in yourself. And he says, you can think about something, and it will call up an emotion. So, for example, if you think of something, for example, where somebody harmed you in some way, that will summon up anger. And then if you find out that, well, you know what, let's say, for example, you have a friend, and you come to find out that your friend has been telling lies about you. You hear this. You become very angry. But then you find out, well, actually, they didn't do it. That didn't happen. And with that new judgment, the anger goes away. And so in this way, Aquinas talks about emotions responding to reason and even being able to be guided by reason, but in a different way than our minds can control our hands and so on. That's all I want to say for this, but that Aquinas has this sense of emotions respond to reason intrinsically because all emotions respond to cognition, and then also that emotions are guided by reason, we can think in certain ways, and then the way we think can then prompt our passions to respond accordingly. And this is because the emotions are intrinsically related to cognition. Next thing I'm just going to skip over, I talked Christology and the emotions, and just an important point there is that for Aquinas, the figure of Christ is an important reference point for thinking about passions. So Aquinas will say, well, listen, in the Gospels, Jesus gets angry. This is proof that anger can be good. Or in the Gospels, Jesus gets sad. Therefore, sadness can be virtuous. Not just as you know, because as you know, many Stoic thinkers would say, you know, sadness is somehow a weakness. No, this is not just okay. This is virtuous. Okay, so now moving to emotion and rhetoric. So first, phantasms, metaphors, and concept formation. In my own research, my own research has moved on from emotion, and I've been working on other things for several years now. But one interesting point of development in an unrelated field of my research, which has given me new perspectives on emotion, is the metaphorical nature of all cognition. Now, I don't know how much you and your research group have spent time on this, but you know, for the past 40 years or so, there's been this growing movement, cross-disciplinary, that looks at the metaphorical dimensions of how we know and how we think, and coming to a better appreciation for how rooted in metaphor our thought process is, our language is, and so on. Now, this is something that, following Aristotle, Aquinas implicitly recognized. It wasn't, he didn't develop it the way contemporary thinking is developing it, but there is a very interesting insight that he has which corresponds to this movement, this contemporary movement. And that is, following Aristotle, Aquinas holds that all of our intellectual concepts involve phantasms. That is, little bits of sense experience that we experience mentally. You know, when you think of what a lemon tastes like, you can almost taste something sour. That's a phantasm. Or you call to mind the voice of a friend. That's a phantasm. Or you call to mind a picture of some kind, something you've seen. That's a phantasm. And so for Aquinas and Aristotle, our concepts somehow order those phantasms. That we have intellects, so there's something without material, immaterial in our thinking, but those concepts are somehow constructed using phantasms. They go beyond phantasms, but they are intrinsically connected to them. And so with this in mind, this is, I think, a very helpful insight to reflect on why it is that we as humans can respond so passionately to abstract concepts being discussed, or how, for instance, abstract concepts of justice can inspire a strong emotional reaction because they're connected to phantasms. And therefore, there is something very earthy and physical in our concepts that are, therefore, our passions, which are rooted in our bodies, are rooted especially in sense experience, can have something to respond to, something that can prompt them. And then on the other hand, I'm thinking about bad rhetoric. That bad rhetoric often, by applying this analysis, is using concepts that are not tied in a concrete way to phantasms, that are somehow too blurry. You know, when somebody's talking, they're not, you know, sometimes this will be a criticism that we might have of something we've read or a speech. It was, you know, it was too vague. It wasn't concrete enough. And I think one of the things that kind of criticism is getting at is that what was being said was not good enough in phantasms, in our sense experience, that could then be somehow responded to on an emotional level. And one of the things I also, apart from my research, I've spent now over a year and a half now spending time in China, spending some time learning Chinese as well. And that is a language that is deeply rooted in metaphor, both in the written characters, but also in oral speech. And that's one of the great gifts of the Chinese language, is that it's so concrete. There can be problems in communicating because of less being there's a lot less grammar. But one of the strengths of the language is that it's so rooted in metaphor and therefore in concrete experience and so on. So that's one important point, which I think there's a lot. Aquinas does not develop a lot of this, but I think there's a lot that could be developed about Aquinas's relevance to rhetoric by developing the implications of what Aquinas says about how concepts are connected to phantasms. Oh, and incidentally, I would say, and to me, speaking of phantasms as bearing somehow connected to conveying knowledge and cognition means that they're like metaphors. They're, when they are using our sense experience, they're calling to mind some element of our sense experience to talk about something else, and thus are intrinsically metaphorical. And so this is a point of contact, I think, as I said, with this discipline of metaphor studies. So then lastly, turning to a time when Aquinas is talking about the grace of speech. So it's something this invitation has really caused me to reflect on more. Is it is very strange that Aquinas, being a member of the Order of Preachers, he joined 30 years, 35 years after the order was founded. So people were very conscious what they were about, that the purpose of preaching, that Aquinas barely talks about preaching in the Summa Theologiae. And he barely talks about rhetoric. You really have to kind of scour the text to find something related. So I have to say that it's an interesting puzzle, why it is that he says so little about it. You could develop a lot from it, but you really have to work at it. Anyway, so this is one passage where you can find something among the most direct and relevant to the topic of rhetoric. And so I just skip to the second paragraph. And he's talking, the idea is, Aquinas is talking about, it's in the context of special gifts of the Holy Spirit and the grace of speech to help someone speak well. And he doesn't specify it because it could just be any kind of communication, but he seems to have most in mind some kind of public Christian preaching of some kind. And he gives three things that this grace of speech is about. First, it is something that is ordered to instructing the intellect. So this first one has little to do directly with moving emotion, with inspiring emotion. But then the second one is very explicitly to move the affection and also to delight the hearers. So this is a very striking thing that he puts in there. He's giving three things. This is the one time that I'm aware of where Aquinas is talking about what preaching is about. He's the greatest theologian in the history of the Dominican order dedicated to preaching. And this is all he has to say. But a big thing is moving the intellect and delighting the listeners. Very much focused on the emotions and affections. And notice here, this is a place where affection, being aware that Aquinas has this other category of intellectual affections that are not passions, is helpful. Here, he is probably meaning both. Any kind of affection, whether a passion of the soul or an intellectual affection, whatever. Somehow moving the affections. And then, he said the last part is that people come to love what the words signify and desire to fulfill them. So something that inspires a kind of forward movement, in a sense, after the speaking is over, to desire and to move towards whatever has been proposed. And so in this little bit, there's more, perhaps there'll be questions, that gives you a sense of Aquinas' interest when the few times he talks about rhetoric, in especially connecting it to emotion. And also, deeper within that, you see how what Aquinas has in mind is this larger scheme of ethics, where the ethical life is not simply about obeying. It's not about just doing good things. It's about the fulfillment of desire. And so what does the grace of speech do? It leads people to desire and to move to love and to desire, and then move towards what they love and desire. So I think I will stop here, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Professor Lombardo, thank you very much for your speech. There's so many interesting things for us to think about that it's going to take a while for us to digest all this information. But right now we are going to open for questions, and some of them will be made in Portuguese, and Pedro will make the translation for you, ok? Pessoal, então nós temos meia hora aí para perguntas, e vocês podem fazer perguntas em português ou em inglês. Sintam-se à vontade para abrir os microfones, para escrever nas caixinhas de diálogo, e o Pedro vai ajudar a gente a conduzir essas perguntas aqui. E ele está aberto para o que vocês quiserem aí perguntar, mesmo que seja de interesse pessoal aí para pesquisas individuais.
Posso começar? Fazendo as perguntas? Yeah.
Faz em português, Pedro, depois você fala em inglês, para o pessoal acompanhar.
Tá, ok. I'll say the question in Portuguese first, so my peers may understand it, and then I'll repeat it in English. Okay, Father? Just 1 second. Então, a minha pergunta é sobre a questão que ele fala no livro dele, que para que ocorra uma reação passional, é importante entender a intenção que atribuímos aos objetos, né? Então, nós atribuímos a intenção ao objeto de prazeroso, perigoso, doloroso, etc. E depois tem uma reação passional. Esse é o nexo entre a cognição e o objeto. A minha pergunta que eu vou fazer para o padre é se, portanto, o sentido que a São Tomás de Aquino separa como sendo o sentido que faz justamente, o sentido interno que faz justamente essas atribuições subjetivas, seria mais central do que os outros sentidos para compreender uma reação passional. Ok? Então, vou traduzir agora a pergunta aqui. So my question, Father, is that in your book, you talk about the importance of intention to understand Aquinas' taxonomy of the passions, and how understanding intentions is important to avoid certain confusions that may arise between the connection of the objects to the passions, right? Now, that leads me to wonder whether this priority or this importance attributed to intention leads us to think that the estimativa, the estimative power or faculty, is more important to understanding emotional reactions than the other internal senses. So, and if so, if it is more important, is it more important in the sense that every emotional reaction will have the activation of an estimation? Or is it just a central case where most emotional reactions will have an estimation, but it is possible for us to have an emotional reaction without an estimation, or something we feel the pain, but we haven't realized where that pain is coming from. Maybe there was no cognition, or and nevertheless there is a passionate response.
Okay, well, that's a very good question. And just to say, if there's one area where in the past 10 years there have been a lot of debates of interpretation about Aquinas, it's in questions very much related to this, and how what exactly is the role of the cognitive power or a particular reason vis-a-vis passions. And just first of all, just to make a clarification of terminology, Aquinas calls let me start from. For Aquinas, there are two faculties of reason. he identifies in the human person. One he calls universal reason, which is like the intellect that he would say angels have too. And then there is particular reason, which is physical. He points to following, I think, some Arabic physician. He says it's in a certain part of the brain is where it's located. And it is a power of making judgments about whether something is good or bad for us, so that the emotions can then run to it. Aquinas will call particular reason, he'll also call it the cognitive power. He will only call it the estimative power in animals. It functions a very similar way, but in animals, he calls it the estimative power, because for animals, for Aquinas, like the supreme court for animals is the estimative power. The sheep concludes, smells the air, smells wolf. The estimative power says, danger. That is a bad smell. Be careful. Whereas for humans, there is a higher court of appeal that we might have an initial kind of reaction. Our particular reason will immediately make a judgment. But then the universal reason can affect that. But back to the question. So one of the debates in a lot of the contemporary literature is, do the passions always follow reason? Or do sometimes the passions, in a sense, go ahead of reason? And that's a question that's out there. And I think the answer is very clear, but this is my view, just to know that this is a contentious issue, is that the passions always follow reason. However, they don't always follow universal reason. That the passions always follow particular reason, the part that is bodily, the part that we have in common with animals, but they don't always follow the universal reason. And if I were going to critique what's been written in the past 10 years, what I think is a big problem in what's been written is that people don't recognize that when Aquinas says reason, he could mean two different things. He could mean particular reason, which is bodily, or he could mean universal reason, which is equivalent to the intellect. And so when you read Aquinas, he says passions always follow reason. You have to say, well, which reason is he talking about? Because it doesn't always follow universal reason, but it does always follow particular reason. Because, and now the other thing, one example that was in the question was about that you feel a pain and then react immediately. Well, the pain for Aquinas is a passion of the body. So it's only passions of the soul that always respond to cognition. Passions of the body don't need any kind of cognition. And this is one of the ways the terminology can be confusing, because sometimes Aquinas will just say passions. And usually he means passions of the soul, but he might just mean passions to include passions of the body and passions of the soul. So I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. Who else would like to make a question?
Posso fazer uma pequena pergunta?
Por favor, Samuel.
Certamente. Bom, então, primeiramente em português, para que todos possam acompanhar, né? Então, eu vou fazer uma pergunta referente à ligação da alma ao corpo e os efeitos simultâneos, né? Tanto dos sentidos externos, que são os corpóreos, a alma, e aqueles internos da alma sobre a percepção própria do corpo, né? Que essa relação tem uma importância muito grande para as paixões de São Tomás, assim como em Aristóteles, que é a fonte principal. So, Father, bless me, please. I had a little question about the circumstance of the internal senses and the external senses. When, suppose, a passion of fear makes the person close the eyes not to see, for example, a liar. And we can see in this little example that an effect of internal senses interfere at the external senses. I don't want to see someone lying to me with an intention to make me do something that I don't want. In this case, we have an internal sense to external sense, but can be the inversion. With a little alternation of voice, we can provoke the fear. So we can see at the prima pars from the Summa Theologiae, question 75, the question about the soul and the body. If the soul is immortal, being the body corruptible. And at this we can see at one of the articles the circumstances of the mutual influences of and soul. So you can speak what for us about the circumstances in passion that the soul and the body have a collaboration, mutual collaboration.
So I didn't fully understand the question. So I understand it's about the ability to summon fear, like when I close my eyes and thinking of something, for example, being concerned about somebody misleading me or in some way. Is that? Anyways, so with us, so when you bring up this example of fear and being lied to, now one of the things that's interesting about this example is that animals don't get afraid of being lied to. That's something that is a distinctively human reality. And so this example is a great example for showing how that these experiences of fear that we might have that are not so physical, they still involve the physical elements of emotion. You know, you can think of, in a sense, an abstract concern of being lied to, of being misled. And that can provoke, you know, in some cases, you know, adrenaline, your heart pumps more, whatever. And so the one thing that Aquinas, when he talks about the ability of reason to guide the passions, he focuses on how you know, we could say today, from what we know today, this only applies to some kinds of problems with fear. But, you can imagine, having some concern, you're afraid of something, and then a friend tells you, well, listen, here's different reasons why in this situation you don't have to worry about being lied to, or even if they do lie to you, it will work out. And then, as a result, you hear that, and you're like, oh, okay. And then as your cognitive judgment changes, your passions respond differently, and the fear goes down. So that's a kind of, that's where the complicated way, the universal reason interacts with the particular reason. Because you're having a discussion with your friend at this abstract level, and yet eventually the universal reason can affect the particular reason. So you think about the same thing, and your passions respond differently. So I'll stop there.
Professor, since you talked about universal reason and particular reason, can you one more time explain the difference in Aquinas' theory on these two kinds of reason? Because, as you know, we are working with the Trajetória das Paixões, which is called the Pathways of Passion that I mentioned yesterday to you. And in the Pathways of Passions, it's very important to know when reason takes place and changes the judgment, helps to change the judgment with the emotion that is arisen with the reason. So for us, it's important to have this difference between universal reason and particular reason, because we don't find that in Aristotle's. So if you could explain it to us, please. Just one second. I'm going to translate the question very quickly. Gente, eu perguntei para ele qual que é a diferença de razão universal e razão particular, porque para São Tomás de Aquinas tem uma diferença. E a razão influencia na emoção que a pessoa vai sentir e na mudança de julgamento. Então, é uma acréscimo à trajetória das paixões, essa ideia de razão universal e razão particular. Ele vai tentar explicar a diferença para nós. Please.
So, one way that Aquinas thinks about this relationship between universal reason and particular reason is in that, with that metaphor he gets from Aristotle about politics. So there's a sense of that reason works with the passions, but it has to kind of respect that the passions want what they want. That you can't get the passion of anger you can't change its fundamental structure, for example. You can only guide it. So I think one important principle is that the universal reason has to respect the particular reason and its own fundamental structure. And so that means respecting that we are bodily, that our passions are tied to our bodies, to our judgments are tied to our bodies. And so here I'm talking with special, okay, how do you successfully kind of change particular reason? It's judgment. So if a universal reason wants to change particular reason's judgment, it's got to respect that structure and work with it. And I think this is where, it's not something Aquinas draws out, but I think it's a very fruitful pathway to think about, is to see that, well, if universal reason is going to affect particular reason, it has to speak particular reason's language. And what is particular reason's language? Phantasms, the imagination experience. And so the way to get kind of the abstraction into the judgment, into the body, because that's, in a sense what it is, this judgment, it has to be going through sense experience, phantasms.
Seu microfone está desligado, doutor.
Thank you very much, Professor. Any other questions? Quem mais gostaria de perguntar? Nós temos aí mais uns 8 minutinhos, se vocês quiserem aproveitar.
Since no, can I ask another one? Is it okay? Is it allowed?
Please.
Yes. Okay. I just wanted you were talking about phantasms and how they are analogous to metaphors in our understanding because they speak to our physical bodily experience. And they could be used to understand more abstract concepts. And you said how the metaphorical nature of cognition. Where can we find more readings about this perspective? Who would you suggest we start by?
There was a book in the late 1970s. I think it was called Metaphors We Live By. I think two authors, Lakoff and something else. Okay.
Yeah.
And that book that's kind of like a foundational text. And I know Cambridge University Press, of course I know the English literature better, but Cambridge University Press has 1 or 2 editions of a companion to metaphor studies that would have a lot of leading figures from different disciplines, giving some perspective, and then that would be a great resource to track down more information about it. But it's once I kind of came across it, for example, my PhD supervisor wrote a very important book on metaphor and religious language. And even she in her book wasn't aware of some of that was written a while ago, but she wasn't aware of this strand of research. So it's something that within a lot of, ironically, because it's a very philosophical topic, but my experience is a lot of philosophers and theologians are not aware of this intellectual movement. But it's present in a great number of other disciplines. It seems to have a foothold. And when I came to it because I'd already come to the same conclusion. My experience in China is something that really deepened my appreciation for metaphor and how it communicates. So, I found it because I was already persuaded in many ways. So I'd like to see it become better known because I think it's true, and it's a very helpful discipline. It's not, again, there's this kind of realm where it's very active, but it seems its research has not penetrated a lot of disciplines yet.
Okay. We have 4 more minutes, and if I would like to complete Peter's question, and I'm going to say it in Portuguese first, and then I translate it to English. Dos nossos alunos aqui do programa de doutorado, o Valmir, está estudando a retórica da música. E me intrigou bastante a sua fala sobre phantasms, que essa categoria, né, que é uma categoria que a gente quase não estuda aqui em Aristóteles, ela trabalha com esse lado metafórico do cérebro. Então, quando a gente usa a música como um objeto persuasivo, na verdade a gente quer despertar phantasms no ouvinte para que aquilo leve-o a uma emoção específica. Então vou perguntar se ele concorda com essa visão ou não. So my question is, here in University of Franca we have a PhD student that is working on musical rhetoric. He is trying to understand what's the power of music to convince people in doing something or to leading people to feel something. He's trying to investigate this. And the concept you brought to us about phantasms seems to be very helpful, because when you play a song and you want the person to feel something, you really want to make her pass through metaphorical relations in her brain, his brain, and feel the feeling that you want her to feel. Do you agree with that? Do you have any suggestion on that?
Oh, first of all, my immediate reaction is that's a very interesting PhD topic. I think that's very interesting. And I'll share something related about emotion in music that I've reflected on, which is that, I mean, my experience, I think a lot of people's experience, is that a form of art that most easily inspires strong emotions is music. I mean, I see a beautiful painting. Maybe I'm moved, maybe not, but I rarely have a very, very strong emotional reaction that's more powerful. But music can quickly alter mood. I don't know if any of you do this. If I'm working on some project, if I play kind of energetic music, I write better. I have more energy. And I think my hunch is that music is intrinsically involves memory, because music only works because it passes through time. And so what you hear right now doesn't mean anything except what you just heard and what you expect to hear. And emotion is something we didn't get a chance to talk about, but memory is another very important element of emotion. And I think there's something about music, because it passes through time and because it involves memory, there is something that it's tapping into the structure of emotion. And because phantasms, that we call up, they're rooted in our memories. Anyway, but I think that's a very fruitful, very interesting topic. And so I just throw out that memory might also be something interesting to look at in that context.
Thank you very much for your answer. We got to the end of our time, so I would like to thank all the participants that joined us in this afternoon, but mainly, of course, I would like to thank you very much, Professor Lombardo, for being with us here and to letting us know you better, letting us know Aquinas much better than we could without your help. And I hope this is the beginning of a more fruitful relation, and maybe I can send one of my students to go there and study a little closer to you. I think Pedro has this dream of going to America and making part of his PhD studies in America, and we can open new fields of studies, I hope.
I hope so too.
I want to know that you're always very welcome in our university in Brazil, in our group, and we are also open to make lectures if you would like to invite us, or if you want to know us better. We are open to make this relation fruitful for both sides.
Thank you.
Okay, so in the name of University of Franca, of the PARE group, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you once again for inviting me. Thank you.
Bye-bye. And you're going to be receiving your certificate through Pedro, okay?
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.